My name is Sara Davis, and I'm a PhD student in the English department here and a graduate affiliate of the center. So I'm really excited to be here this morning. Part of my research deals with graphic narrative, so I'm very excited to hear what our presenters have to say. I'm going to introduce them individually before they present, and then let them go for it. So first we have Marc DiPaolo from Southwestern Oklahoma State University. He is assistant professor of English at Southwestern Oklahoma State University. He is author of Fire and Snow, Climate Fiction from the Inklings to Game of Thrones, War, Politics, and Superheroes, Ethics and Propaganda in Comics and Film, and Emma Adapted, Jane Austen's heroine from book to film. He has edited 5 collections of scholarly essays on intersections of film, literature, politics, and religion, and has been interviewed on NPR and BBC4. And the title of his presentation this morning is Hellboy, the Goon, Graphic Alterity, and the Undermining of Anti-Working Class Stereotyping. So Marc, whenever you are ready.
Oh, okay, cool.
I'm going to introduce you individually.
Oh, that one. So let's see. I've had a kind of a strange career path in terms of what I want to write about. Basically, what it is I don't understand my own personality. Like when I was growing up, it was like my friend Pete Dimitri is like, the best way to be a man in Italian is to be like Gary Cooper. There's not enough people like Gary Cooper. Which I found out later Tony Soprano said all the time, which is wild because that's what my friend kept saying to me. And I was like, well, I don't want to like be a cowboy and carry a gun. That sounds crappy, you know. So I decided I wanted to be like Spider-Man or Mr. Darcy or something, but I wasn't sure which. So I studied both Spider-Man and Mr. Darcy to try to figure out who I should imitate more. My brother says I came up with some kind of strange combination that he calls BBC WAP. Yeah, so I go into academia. It was very important to me to meet fellow confused straddlers. What class are we? What's our gender identity? I don't know. Me neither, you know. So, so I did a book on superheroes in 9/11 because I was living in New York at the time and it traumatized me, so I wanted to use them to understand it because superheroes are saturated in war and terror imagery. And it was just an autobiographical barf of emotions for like 400 pages, and people responded to it. So I was like, oh, cool. You know, so I was like, I do a sequel. What should I do? Class. I've got to talk about class, especially since a lot of the superheroes I didn't talk about in that were slightly less famous, but they're all getting Netflix TV shows like Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, Daredevil. And I was like, oh, people know who they are now, because I wanted to write about the ones that had the movies and the TV shows because I assumed nobody read the comics. So I started with Batman and Wonder Woman and all those, but I was like, hey, these guys are becoming, like, freaking Ant-Man is a movie now. Like people know who Ant-Man is, like, not even the main Ant-Man, like the second Ant-Man, you know? Like, it's not Henry Pym, it's Scott Lang. I don't even know who Scott Lang is. Like, it's weird. So, people know who Thanos is. It's strange. So, when I was a kid, the most famous working class superhero was the Thing from the Fantastic Four. It was a guy made of rocks. Actually, I should show you. Like, I didn't really understand class at all. I just knew that he was from New York. He's from Brooklyn, you know, and he played poker and he smoked cigars. So like, he was created by a World War II veteran Jewish artist named Jack Kirby. So here's him playing poker with all the other superheroes. It's a little small, but you know, he's got the winning hand. He's totally going to beat Spider-Man and the Wolverine and everybody. And this is another sort of, if you want a bust of him, I don't have a bust of him in my office. I've got 2 statues of Wonder Woman, a bust of Spider-Man, and Shadow Cat, the really cool Jewish X-Men who I was in love with in 7th grade. There's the Thing again. I guess he's in a lineup for some reason. And that's him played by Michael Chiklis in one of the movies. And for some reason, Frank Sinatra. Okay. Yeah, it's clobbering time. Like he drops his G's, you know. And what's great is when he fights. I don't know if they have him fight. It was him fighting the Hulk. He always loses to the Hulk. I always feel bad for him. I always hope he'll pull it out. He never does. And the best is when he fights Dr. Doom, because he's an Eastern European dictator who refers to himself in the third person and has no sense of humor. And he's always like, I am Doom, and I will defeat you. And the Thing's like, fuck you. It's almost like a class battle right there. And I didn't get any of that. I just knew, I thought this was awesome. Like, I was like, I hope you win, Thing. Like, just knock him down, Thing. And so I was like, wow, at 42, maybe I can write something academic about this. Try to understand. And And as I'm talking about this to my department chair, Tracy Floriani, she's like, I think I know an organization you might like. And she introduced me to Michelle Fazio, and I was like, I don't know quite enough about this. I'm interested in this. I mean, I've done class with Jane Austen, but I better make it an anthology because I don't want to pretend I got this cold, you know. And Michelle was awesome essay on Walking Dead.
Oh, yeah.
And the original title was Working Class Superheroes, and the readers for University of Mississippi said, you can't put in Walking Dead. I was like, I got a new title, Working Class Comic Book. You know, it was amazing how many problems that solved. It went from unpublishable to publishable. Like, I was like, guys, you gotta calm down. I wasn't sure what to kind of read you there. Two kind of separate sections, both of which I was excited about. But one's sort of about how the comic books take demonic representations of working class figures and undercut them. And another one, I had this thing about how much money all these famous superheroes make, like the incomes levels for Superman and stuff. So, and I don't quite have time for both, so I'm kind of, let me see. Okay, how am I going to do this? Okay, so Hellboy. Okay. Yeah, so Hellboy, there's a character created by an artist named Mike Mignola, and his father was a working class Italian American cabinet maker, and he would just keep injuring himself making cabinets. He was covered in cuts, but he would just soldier on and make the cabinets. And Mike loved his father so much, when it came time to create his own superhero, he wanted to make something in the vein of The Thing, but updated for the 1990s, because The Thing was a 60s character. And he decided to make his dad the lovable demon Hellboy. And he starts out as a demon. He should be a demon because he normally should have these huge horns, but he's like, no, I'm nice, despite my appearance. And he takes like a saw and cuts the horns off. And he's like, see, no horns, you know. And so there's this idea that there's an expectation that a working class person is going to be monstrous on some level. He's going to be brutish, he's going to be racist, he's going to sexually harass people, he's going to be dumb, and meanwhile he's got the soul of a prince. Like, The Thing has, despite his rocky exterior, he's got the world's most beautiful blue eyes. And he's called the soul of the Fantastic Four, you know, and he's the kind uncle, you know. So when he goes out in the street, everyone in Manhattan is terrified of him and runs screaming, but they don't know that he saved them from Dr. Doom last week. And the same thing with Hellboy, you know. There's always an H.P. Lovecraft riff that's opening up with tentacle monsters coming through, and Hellboy's like, I got this, and he's got this huge fist, he goes, and very subtle, the tentacle monster coming through, he's like, I'll handle it, boom, punch the tentacle monster back through, close the rift, you know. Not much science involved, just a big fist, you know. The version of the poster, of this poster I had in my book, and I couldn't find it online, is we've got a fish man, Liz is kind of, she's a little rough around the edges, and we've got Hellboy, and the poster said, believe it or not, these are the good guys, you know. And I realized there's sort of a trend with working class comic book characters. The Thing's made of rocks, Hellboy's a demon, and then we've got the Goon, who is drawn like a gangster from like a Dick Tracy comic, but he's actually a good guy too. And he's got a heavily, I love this, first of all, the zombies protesting for labor rights. Now, he usually protects this small western town southwestern town from zombie invasion. In his past as a mob enforcer makes him perfectly fit to keep the zombies at bay. But there's an interesting moment where they decide to team up and put aside their political differences and fight for better pay for zombies and working class humans. So I like that image. The problem with these images is they're sort of still images. And there's a really cool essay by Jared Gardner in Multicultural Comics about how comics really did start out fairly supremely racist, yellow journalism, one paragraph, yellow peril kinds of anti-immigrant diatribes, because you just look at it, it's like freezing a troubling looking person in a moment in time, and that's all you need to know about them, right? Here's the scary yellow devil, you know. And he said one of the interesting things in Gardner's essay in History of Comics is as newspapers started to use them, and they would do multi-panels, and they would hire artists who were either immigrants themselves or the descendants of immigrants. They would disrupt that by taking what was originally a horrifying cartoon and turning it into a heroic figure. And one of the ways they would do it is by having multiple panels. They would say, no, one image isn't all you really need to know about this person. There's several images, and here's them acting. So you would have a creature over several panels doing something heroic. And also the spaces between the panels, where your mind fills in the action, helps participate in the undermining of the flat image. And he called, Jared Gardner called that graphic alterity. And he was applying it very specifically to racist caricatures. We realized it works very well with class caricatures with Hellboy and the Goon. So to have, some fairly standard accusations in the way they're drawn, unintelligent, hyper-masculine, scarred from their work, and the sort of expectation that it's the usual white male racist guy, And I also thought as I was working, I was revising this, during all the discussion of the white Trump voter. I was like, well, here we go. You can't trust these guys. They voted for him, But no, he didn't, But that's sort of the idea. We'll do several panels and undercut that. Now, one of the things about that I always wonder, I go to the interviews with the artists and writers to see if I'm just making all this up, because I'm always accused of that, But people accuse you of that really fast in kind of a dumb way. Like, I heard a DJ one time trying to deconstruct the song, "She's got dumps like a truck, baby move that butt. And the DJ says, I want to do an English major exercise. I think she's got a large butt and she looks good when she swings it. And people called in and said, you're reading too much into it. So I was like, well, I felt that gave me license, to do my close readings. Because people will object to anything, I think. But as it turns out, like, I think the artist of the Goon was and wasn't intentionally doing what I was saying he was doing, right? Like, and let me see if I can find the interview. What he says is, oh, come on. It's like right here. Yeah, anyway. Here we go. So he had no writing experience. He just was an artist, and he said, but he wanted to write it, so he just started drawing. And the first couple issues are pretty weird in terms of art and writing. But it really gets more and more sophisticated as it goes along. And he says, I wanted to be able to tell tragic stories, humor and horror, and anything that interested me. And I had the idea that the Goon got his scars in Chinatown. And it was a pretty broad comic, sort of with a Marx Brothers style sense of humor, with images from the Universal monsters and 30s gangster films. And it was a mishmash that way. But he's like, well, if he's scarred, like, that's not funny, that's not happy. So how do I deal with that? He says, I wanted it to be a sad story that wasn't funny at all because I wanted it to twist the reader's idea of what a comic book should be. I wanted to surprise readers, to keep them guessing what I was trying to go for with the comic. It's important for me that the characters, whether they're goofy or cartoony, should still have emotional depth. You're limiting yourself to what you can do with the character if you see the character as one-dimensional. Some of the funniest people on the planet are the most tragic. You hear all the time about comedians and they have these tragic, sad lives that they've had, but through their comedy they found an escape or a release from that. I want to have characters that show some depth and have a little more meaning than just something out there for a laugh. And I think the result of this is very interesting, very nuanced, and a surprising read. And academics love the Goon, even though it's, this like they throw poo at each other, and it's kind of ridiculous. And I think this Eric Powell, has read some of the criticism of his work and doesn't like it because I don't know if it's telling him what he's doing or what, but he has a scene when a college professor meets Hellboy and he's like, this is what you're doing and I love it, and Hellboy just puts poo in his face. So when I wrote to him, I said, hey, can I use this for the cover of my book? Guess who didn't write back, and color me surprised, So I'm contributing to the literature that, he can make fun of. But anyway. But one of the things I wanted to kind of say in the intro, and it's one of the points of the book, and it's very emotional. Like, I always proceed from emotion, intuition before logic, which is ridiculous for a PhD, but I do. That empathy is, I think, the hardest thing to achieve, and it's so important to me. And whenever in the news, when you see like a real liberal activist, like a real working class champion. The news is so invested in unmasking them as a fraud somehow, and so people who could do good are so skewered. But it's hard to unmask, like it's hard to say anything bad about Daredevil or The Thing, right? Because everybody grew up with them. If you say something bad about a superhero people grew up with when they were 5 and wore their underoos, they go, don't say anything bad about Batman, you know? But, you know, like Linda Tirado, like, oh, she's a phony, right? You know, Barbara Ehrenreich, she's a communist, right? You know, it's so easy to say that, you know, as an environmentalist who flies around the world trying to get people to go solar, oh, he's got a big carbon footprint. You know, you could say all kinds of dumb things about people who are trying to make the world a better place. So what I did was I paired, it's like some of the writers, like, you know, who write about class in sort of the middle brow venues that get demonized, and I say, well, everything they're saying is in this comic, but we're more likely to listen to this comic because it's got freaking zombies in it, you know, or because the Thing's cool, you know, he fights Dr. Doom. And so I said, this could be the trial run. If you can learn to like The Thing or Hellboy, maybe you can give Barbara Ehrenreich another look, you know, kind of, you know. And I know I'm reaching here, but honestly, I grew up in the 80s when liberalism and multiculturalism was like Mr. T and George Papard fighting drug dealers together. Like that was solidarity. So the idea that like, so I get, you know, so comic books actually moved me markedly to the left, you know. So they did it to me. I go online, I meet all kinds of crazy young white guys who read comics and they're nuts, but I keep hoping that it will happen to more than just me, and I think it does. So that was the motivation of the book, which was just very personal, and I had to start personal. I was like, okay, I guess I have to intellectualize this now and make it acceptable to the University of Mississippi Press. Where I was, you know, Michelle helped me with that. You know, she's like, this is how we're going to do it. And she gave me a plan, and I did it. So I think it came out, but it's mostly thanks to her. She put me here, she wrote an awesome Working Dead essay, and this is kind of, I guess I'm out of time.
You have 4 minutes.
Oh, I do?
You
Do you want to hear how much money like Superman makes and stuff? Is that cool? Is that? Okay, I don't want to, okay. Because this was like, this is what I wrote first before I got all theoretical. I was like, I'm going to leave the theory for later. I want to start writing about the incomes of like man thing. Yeah, okay, so throughout their history, superheroes have appeared in comics, films, and television narratives depicted as secularized demigod figures, multi-billionaire gentleman heroes, and members of the military-industrial complex. That's my serious voice, yeah. Recent multimedia Batman, Iron Man, and Thor adventures have underscored the idea that superheroes often act as fictionalized stand-ins for and commentaries on members of our real-world ruling classes. While it's unclear precisely how wealthy and politically influential some of them are, several journalists and bloggers have made striking estimations of their financial worth. As a case in point, Buddy Loans published an infographic by John M.G. that identified the Marvel hero. Who's the richest Marvel hero, you think?
Tony Stark.
Close, he's like second maybe. Black Panther.
Yeah.
King T'Challa, the fictional resource-rich African nation of Wakanda. He's just new enough. He hasn't settled in, you know. But yeah, he can buy and sell Tony Stark. But as the wealthiest superhero on worth of an estimated $500 billion, MG gave second place to Tony Stark, who he calculated spent an estimated $1.5 billion developing his Iron Man suits, while being worth $100 billion overall. Bruce Wayne, who owns Wayne Manor, Wayne Enterprises, and 1/3 of the land that Gotham City is built on, boasts an estimated $80 billion portfolio, and Lex Luthor, corporate villain, mad scientist, and former president of the United States, as the Superman universe is worth $75 billion. Guess who Lex Luthor is based on? No, I'm not kidding. Yeah. Dr. Doom, evil techno-mage and totalitarian ruler of the Eastern European nation of Latveria, is worth $35 billion. Oliver Queen, the central character of the Green Arrow comic books and the television series Arrow, see that? He's just the $7 billion man, and the Robin Hood-like owner of Queen Industries. MG's estimates are notably higher than those unveiled by Jacob Davidson of Time magazine, who also attempted the same measurements. He said T'Challa is worth $90 billion, Stark is worth $12.4 billion, and Wayne is $9.2 billion. So whoever's right, you know, both sets contribute to the public perception that superheroes represent the ruling classes, not the working classes, and put forward the idea that superhero narratives promote conservative establishment patriarchal values. And yet, while Stark, Wayne, and T'Challa are among the most famous and recognizable heroes, there are other superheroes who are decidedly impoverished. What's kind of funny is the wealthy superheroes get the blockbuster movies, and the poor superheroes are on TV. Many superheroes may boast exceptional physical strength and supernatural powers, but their enhanced physical abilities do not necessarily translate to a stable income or high-class status in American culture. A number of what might be colloquially called B or C-list superheroes come from humble roots, or they pose as impoverished everymen in their civilian identities like My Man Godfrey, or they may be considered legitimately working class, depending on what rubric you use, I suppose. Complementing the above charts of the wealthy superheroes was Goliath Blogger. I don't even know what Goliath Blog was, but it was useful to me. Wes Walcott's list of the 12 poorest Marvel superheroes. Spider-Man, Luke Cage, and Jessica Jones were quite poor. I was so grateful that the TV shows came out. I was like, I can write about them now, because I really like them. I've liked them since the 90s, It should come no surprise, as Marvel's flagship character, Spider-Man, is among the poorest superheroes. Peter Parker's job as a freelance photographer could earn him about $40,000 a year. Typically, newspaper photographers are only paid $65 a photo assignment. When you consider that photographers are usually required to submit 5 to 10 photos for the client to choose from, that would mean the value of each photo is about $10. So, it's kind of fun comparing these folks. And as a kid, I gravitated towards the poor ones. I hated the Avengers because I was like, oh, they're just like the rich soldier guys. And when they got the movies first, I was like, where's Wonder Woman? She's like a bisexual socialist, wasn't she? And she's coming out. Because I'm telling all my friends, I was like, you're gonna like her better than the others. They're like, superheroes. I was like, no, she's you like her at least marginally better. I'm like, nah. I was like, you don't even know. So it's been kind of fun, and I'm glad to be here. And thanks for being so accepting.
Next we have Sara Appel from Lewis and Clark College. She's an adjunct professor of humanities and English at Lewis and Clark College and Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. Her research and teaching is focused on intersectional working class studies in popular literature and media. And I think you have a change to your title.
Oh, yes, I have.
Possibly, okay.
Okay. Just give me a second here to pull up what I'm doing.
I'm sorry, I didn't move the Goon out of your way.
I think I'm going to just sit here in front of the computer too while I'm presenting and kind of just flip through the slides. So let's see. I guess where would mine be? Let's see. How do I get to?
It's down on the bottom.
Oh. Let me just make sure I understand. Okay. How do I get it on slideshow? Yeah.
Up at the very top. You could do it from there too.
Oh shit.
There it goes.
There we go.
It's good.
Oh, that's not what
So that's the prisoner.
That's
right?
not okay.
So you'll see the next on the right.
Yeah, what is up on the screen is
What
Yeah.
is on the
is
screen
fine.
is on the left.
What is up on the screen is up now. Okay,
Uh-huh.
this should work, hopefully. Okay. Hi. So I've changed the focus of my presentation mostly because I just haven't been able to do the research that I was hoping to do on class and feminism and alternative comics. That was something I presented on actually last year, but I just haven't really been able to continue with it due to my own sort of schedule and general inability to produce much scholarly work lately from being an adjunct and all of that. But one thing I am doing with comics, and I continue to do with comics all the time, is to teach them. I'm actually, as soon as I'm finished up with my current term, which I'm toward the end of, I'm going to be teaching another incarnation of a summer comics class that I came up with. It's called Beyond Wonder Women: Comic and Graphic Novel Feminisms. And this is a class I've taught. This will be the third time that I've gotten to teach this course. It's through Lewis and Clark. And my focus is much less on superheroes and tends to be more the feminist alternative comics. I mentioned this kind of intersectional working class feminism, and those are sort of like the comics I gravitate most toward are much more realist, and they kind of take up these themes or issues. At least those are the comics that I like to read and teach. just a couple of quick examples of which Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez's Love and Rockets is one of my favorites. It's a serialized comic that's been, and it's real. It's this kind of gritty. There's two different narrative universes. One is this LA barrio. And it stars like Latina queer working class characters, and so the one universe is sort of Jaime, one of the brothers. It's the Hernandez brothers, and they sort of serialize this comic together. And that sort of LA punk, it's like this punk rock queer sort of feminist universe in the early '80s, but it's also in real time, and the characters age in real time too, and he's continuing to put this story out. And the main character, Maggie, I think she starts out as a teenager, and she's already, and I think, almost 50 at this point, and we've gotten to see her age. So that's one of the comics. And then there's his brother Gilbert, and they would publish these issues sort of. I think it started out sort of bi-monthly, and now it just kind of gets put out occasionally, sort of as a serialized volume of new work. But his universe is this kind of border town sort of on the U.S.-Mexico border called Palomar. It's sort of this invented sort of border community, but it's also sort of like it's working class and very in that community very poor, and it's also kind of represented as sort of like just isolated from civilization in many respects, and yet also much more modern than things may appear on the surface. And so it's this really interesting sort of multifaceted universe that these two brothers have created. The storylines are generally kept separate, but there's been a few times throughout the history of the comic where they intersect. But anyway, so that's one comic I'm really that I love and that I've taught and that kind of sparked my interest in comics. Honestly, back when I was a grad student, I discovered it. More recent find is Kelly Sue DeCormick and Valentine DeLandro's Bitch Planet. It's a sort of dystopian sci-fi serial. Yeah, it's about these non-compliant women who deviate from sexual, race, and class norms in a very unapologetic way. They're sent to an off-planet prison in outer space where they where they continue to find ways to resist the forced compliance that is sort of being that space was meant to make happen. And so that's one that I'll be teaching that for the first time in this feminist comics class that I'm teaching this summer. But I'm not necessarily here to talk about that course and sort of what tends to happen there. I also tend to teach and incorporate comics at least one per semester or term into every class that I teach. And so I really kind of wanted to just talk about some of my experiences having taught comics in classes that are not necessarily comics based, but I just always figure out a way in my English and humanities class and gender and sexuality studies classes to incorporate comics into what we're doing in the classroom, and especially to focus on themes related to class and sort of like working class experience, life, and politics. Like those issues tend to come up very organically in this kind of within the various intersections that I think are that the comics I'm drawn to tend to represent. And so I really just wanted to sort of maybe talk a little bit about my experience having taught a few of the comics that tend to be my go-tos that I will pull into my English my English and gender studies and sexuality studies courses that I teach. And so, but real quick, this the panel that I've represented here on my first slide is from Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' classic Watchmen, which I'll talk about here in a minute because that's one of the texts that is one of my go-tos actually, which is a little bit more sort of in the I mean, it's a send-up of sort of the superhero genre in a lot of respects, right? But it's also it's an alternative reality representation of sort of the Reagan era 80s, and it's also sort of but really what it is it's sort of this speculative sci-fi commentary on what would have happened had we won the Vietnam War and Nixon not only not been impeached but been given a third term as a result of sort of an actual superhero character. Because in the world of Watchmen, it's all these sort of like they're just like kind of like everyday people who feel marginal, who just kind of feel marginalized in some respect in their lives, but they're kind of like Marc maybe. They fetishize they've grown up loving superheroes and they want to be superheroes, and so they kind of like take it upon themselves to create this sort of like, not super, but sort of like vigilante costumed hero group, because I think they feel powerless in the face of this sort of like, very kind of dystopian vision of like what would happen if Nixon got this third term, and that neoliberalism had been able to sort of run rampant, or even been sort of ramped up as a result of that. And so it's about, it's a very kind of depressed and socio-political environment that these characters are attempting to just kind of negotiate their own sort of powerlessness within, and so they kind of, they're like, we're going to take it upon ourselves to sort of like, become these costumed heroes that we wish existed in the world. And yet there is one actual true superhero, and that's Dr. Manhattan, and he is this, basically what he is he's a scientist who, I don't know, it's a really interesting origin story. Like he winds up walking into some sort of like nuclear reactor chamber. He gets locked in there by accident in the middle of some kind of, I don't know, they're experimenting with matter and sort of transmuting matter. And then he gets vaporized, but then he comes back in this form, and he's like this sort of like superpowered, like almost like nuclear warhead that he becomes in many respects. He's like he becomes a living nuclear weapon. And so that's how, in the narrative universe of Watchmen, we're able to win the Vietnam War, is because Dr. Manhattan exists and is sort of the ultimate Cold War deterrent. And so we're able to sort of use him to get the Viet Cong to stand down in these ways, and then so that sort of enables that war to be to take a different turn as far as and then of course you can see the implications for like the Nixon presidency, and so it's this alternate vision of what would happen if we had a superhero that was also this a nuclear weapon, and he's this very neutral kind of character too. It's like a lot of his character revolves around sort of his coming to terms with just the fact that he's been given this by accident, this immense, basically the ability to either annihilate humanity, but he doesn't want it. He's very passive, and at one point he just leaves and goes to Mars, and he's like, I'm out of here. And then of course everything goes to hell because the nuclear deterrent has just left the planet. And so anyway, so that's a little bit about Watchmen. But I'm going to get to in a moment the ways that, and I'll talk more about the character of Rorschach, who is sort of like what we tend, in my classes that I've taught this graphic novel, my students' attention tends to sort of gravitate toward, and we have a lot of really interesting discussions of sort of class and toxic masculinity around an analysis of that character. And that's, you can see Rorschach there in the back, that's him in the background, and he's one of these costume vigilantes, but he's also kind of a lone wolf. Even when the vigilante group breaks up, and they kind of decide, I'm done with this costumed superhero gig, or the world doesn't need us anymore because they have Dr. Manhattan now, and we're not going to really have much of an impact, and they kind of try to move on with their lives. Rorschach he refuses to ever sort of deoccupy this position of self-imposed sort of like his vigilante. His identity as Rorschach is his true. He's assumed it as his true self in many respects, and I think that has a lot to do with sort of like his class, his experiences early in life with certain traumas that revolve around his class background and poverty. But anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. Shoot. Oh, there it is. I don't know why it's not. Sorry, I guess I need to get this. It's doing a weird thing here. I don't know why. It's like showing me half of my previous slide.
I guess it's in case you want to go back, or is it obscuring?
It's like obscuring my ability to see the full slide. Yeah. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, okay. That'll work. But one of the comics that I tend to teach a lot, and I actually just finished up teaching, is Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis. I've taught this in most recently in my Intro to Women's Literature class at Portland State just this term. And one of the really great conversations that we were able to have about that comic in class revolved around this chapter called The Key. And really, what you're seeing there is it's a particular panel that where and the discussion revolves around these young men who, or sort of like the way that class determines which young men and boys are conscripted to fight in the Iraq-Iran war in the early 80s. Like it's a very class-based system for conscription of these boys, but it also revolves around, at one point in the story, Marjan is from, and the interesting thing is she's she's very class conscious in her own sort of analysis of like how being this kind of like upper middle class privileged, from a more privileged Iranian family mitigates some of the sort of potential threat of violence that certain other lower class Iranians can't really take for granted in the same way, or at least allows her to have a kind of an experience of like a kind of normal teenage life. And so this panel is like a really important contrast between sort of like the lives that these young boys are being conscripted into, or right around the same time that young Marjan, in her, like the violence of this sort of totalitarian regime is ever present. I mean, because sort of a little more of the context for this graphic novel, it's a memoir, and she's writing about her experiences, sort of in the post-Iranian Revolution era, where there was the overthrow of the Shah in like the late 70s, and yet instead of sort of having this democratic moment where where sort of democracy would be ushered in the wake of the removal of this monarch, an Islamic government was almost immediately elected, and that's characterized the situation in Iran until today. The rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini, and sort of this is sort of like just what it meant for her, to grow up in this situation where she started out in a secular sort of co-ed mixed boys and girls school, not wearing the veil, and then suddenly in this post-revolutionary society, the veil was forced upon all these women or just women in general, and everything went from sort of being this like potential for democracy to flourish to actually in the wake of, I think, a very what I think. Yeah, so it's a commentary on the ways that sort of progressive revolution can so quickly be kind of like, I don't know, like can result in the opposite of what that revolution, of the kind of energy and hopes that revolution was about, which is sort of what happened with the immediate election of, and of course under very dubious circumstances too. I mean, I'm not sure that anybody really in Iran really believed that the 90 whatever percent of the citizens of Iran who were alleged to have voted for elected this Islamic government, that was actually legitimate election, very much in doubt. But it just sort of speaks to sort of like the rise of totalitarianism on sort of the coattails of potential progressive revolution. And so that's sort of the context for this. But this particular panel, we spent a lot of time in my class really looking at in detail, thinking about also the art. Like my students noticed things like, look at the kids down there. It's disturbing because you can see that the key to paradise, and this is how this concept of being conscripted was sold to these young boys, was, and there's a scene where Marjan's upper middle class family, they have a maid, and the maid tells them about her son and what happened in his school, and how they came, the representatives from the military came in and handed out these plastic keys. They were painted gold to all of the boys, and said, if you're lucky enough to die for your country, once you're conscripted into the military, this key will get you into paradise. So wear it around your neck on the battlefield, and you'll get, and then promises of the most beautiful women will be awaiting you there, homes, cars, all the typical things that teenage boys would be thinking about and loving. And so there is this kind of, she does a really great job of sort of just reminding us what it means to be a teenager is very, there's the universal kind of experience of what it means to be a teenager and a teenage boy. She's really good at sort of emphasizing that, but then also just reminding us of sort of the ghoulish nature of the context in which these boys are coming of age, and that something as simple as having desire for a girl or wanting the things that teenagers tend to want could be, oh wow. Okay, well anyway, so we wound up sort of doing a lot of analysis of this comic, sorry, this panel, and my students noticed things like, look at how they're dancing below, and they're also, she's also wearing this necklace that her mother has made for her, and it's like this punk rock, this punk rock aesthetic, and her parents are very much about trying to give her this normal teenage experience, and so her mom will do things like knit her, she let me go to this first party, and not only did she let me go, she also knitted me a sweater full of holes and made me a necklace with chains and nails. Punk rock was in. So there's also, this kind of appropriation of this working class punk thing. And I was looking sharp, but these are the more privileged kids in Iranian society. But the kids above, you can see they're also wearing necklaces, and they're also dancing, but they're dancing in a way that is about as ghoulish as you can imagine. They're being blown to the sky by landmines. And so there's a really wonderful sort of class commentary here, or just important. And it was I was really impressed that my students picked up on that, and that we were able to spend so much time talking about that. Well, I was going to take you through, let's see, a couple of other examples of some analysis that we've done in my classes, but since I'm trying to just get ahead, I can't figure out how to get ahead to the slides here. Oops. How do I go back? Oh, okay, so I guess I just wanted to maybe put up a few of these sort of takeaways that I've gotten from my experience of teaching class, or comics in my classes. How can comics help students learn about class? There's a suspension of the burden of realism, and I think that paradoxically makes gritty, realist stories more accessible and approachable for students. And this is from actually an article by Kate Warren. She's writing about the animated film Persepolis and animation in general, but I think the principle still really applies to comics and sort of what the experience of reading comics and sort of the visual is about there. And she says, in a sense, animation acknowledges the impossibility of representation and is a less didactic approach to depicting particular stories or events. It offers a means for deeply personal, sometimes dangerous stories to be told without the burden of maintaining realism and negotiating authentic reconstruction. And Scott McCloud, who's sort of a preeminent theorist of comics, everyone reads him if you do any kind of comics study or analysis. Simplistic and cartoony drawings take the pressure of negotiating authenticity, or just that question of is this realistic? That students get obsessed with. This idea that if it's not realistic, it's somehow, they're always looking for the real. But it takes that burden off of readers' shoulders and allows them to participate in the narrative world being portrayed in an immersive kind of way, because that burden of realism, and then I think getting at this sort of childlike fascination even with with cartoons, and it functions as and McCloud describes it as a vacuum into which our identity and awareness are pulled. And so it's just the ability to occupy this narrative universe, and then what you were saying about the gutter as a space where participation happens in sort of, that's one of the powerful things about comics, is just how participatory it is. And so you can tell these kinds of stories, and you can, and I think, especially when it comes to class issues, in a more, the more of the kind of realist vein, type stories, you can really tell them in a way where you also take the burden of having to sort of negotiate that authenticity off the table. and it just allows this kind of, you have to participate in the process of meaning making in comics at a very high level. And so, I don't know, I just feel like it's helped students really tap in, especially to some of these like class-based issues and themes that tend to come up in our reading of these stories. So anyway, I guess I talked too much and gave more context than I was planning on giving for some of these texts. But thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Sarah. Last but certainly not least, we have Crystal Hester from, she's a graduate student at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, and she teaches 11th and 12th grade English at Purnell Street High School in Pembroke, North Carolina. And the title of her presentation today is The Modern Epic, Comics and Working Class Literature.
And I'm probably going to kind of go back and forth a little bit here so that I can, for some of the slides, I've got a few images so that I can kind of go back and forth. Basically, I took some of the different critics that our professor had us looking at, Dr. Fazio had us looking at, and one of the critics, Michelle Tokarczyk, wrote about the modern epic in connection with the Triangle Fire poetry. And that really connected with me because I love epics. And so I took that idea and connected it into working class literature as a whole. So one of the things that I wanted to think about was that working class literature, if you read enough of the novels, enough of the nonfiction, if you look at the graphic adaptations and the comic books, of course, it all carries a similar thread all the way through. You get to see these struggles, you get to actually see all of the problems that these different people have, and then, of course, the way that they overcome them. The other thing with the modern epic is that it can actually incorporate all forms of literature. It's not that traditional epic poem that we all think about when we see Beowulf or we see the Iliad and things like that. It's also this similar story told by multiple voices, and that is one of the things that Zandy and, of course, Rennie Christopher and Carolyn Whitson get into with their articles, the idea that we have so many voices that actually make up the we. And even more importantly, we think about the old epics showing us what was going on in these ancient societies. Well, this modern epic actually shows us what's going on in our society. And it actually crosses over into gender. It provides this intersectionality between the races, between gender, between cultures, class, and work itself. And then we also get the formation of a brand new type of hero. We actually get a working class epic hero that can address the issues through various options. The piece that I chose to really focus in on was what Harvey Picard does with Studs Terkel. And he actually does a graphic adaptation, and this is actually the cover of it. And basically he adapts 26 of the 130 original interviews. And he actually does some slight rearranging of some of the articles, but when he does that rearrangement, it actually just puts people into even more similar categories for today. He actually, with these interviews, remains true to the original interview, and he simply lets the artwork do the talking for any information that gets left out. And through this artwork, through the actual words that he uses, it becomes that basis for what I call the working class epic here. Both the words and the artwork as well. Scott McCloud, as has already been mentioned, is kind of the authority on reading and analyzing comics, and he talks about how these comics can actually be used from the gutter, the different panels, all the way through every single choice that a writer and an artist make to give us these cultural environments, to give us these working environments, and actually give us an up-close personal view of these things. And even more importantly, sometimes when authors do adaptations, they actually choose to alter things. They'll give us quick little synopses of what the original author said. Well, the nice thing about what Harvey Pekar does, he sees the value in the wording of these original interviews, and he actually gives these people a voice, and he allows them to speak for themselves. So, why a graphic adaptation of Studs Terkel's work? Well, first of all, graphic adaptations, comic books have traditionally been by and for the working class, as we all know. And that's something that actually started back in the 1930s. Even more importantly, the earlier comics, you could get them for 10 cents each. So they were very affordable, they were very accessible by the working class people. And in quite a bit of the research I did, you would see where these people would purchase these comics and they would literally pass them around until they fell apart. And even more importantly, Superman, he starts out with, as his alter ego, Clark Kent, writing in newspaper articles about all of the problems that capitalism presents. And that's also a thread that keeps running through things like Spider-Man and other comic book heroes like that. However, for as important as the comics were to the working class in 1954, all of a sudden they're seen as bad things. And so their numbers greatly decreased as a result of the 1954 Comics Code. And basically that limited what information could be presented, how graphic it could be, things like that, because we were getting juvenile delinquents. Obviously, comics caused all of that. But in the present, what do they do? Actually, comics now allow for the writers to actually reflect this loss of innocence within the current generations. And we get things like the 9/11 report, we get Watchmen, we get Cancer Vixen, and the Complete Persepolis. And these are all four of these pieces actually highlight political moments. They actually address health issues that are going on within different areas, and they also give us social expectations and how to sometimes fight back against those. And then one of the things that Marc DiPaolo says actually in his new book is that comic books actually offer insightful cultural commentaries about class issues. There is so much more to a comic book than just pretty pictures and cool words on a page. There's actually a message there for those who are interested in looking for it. And even more importantly, they actually offer a serious treatment of class issues, and they are a very quick and easy way to reach a large population. And as Marc was saying in his presentation, I mean, if you go to the theater, guess what? There's nothing but comic book movies out, which thrills me beyond belief, but you know, because I'm much like you, I love these things. And so by producing things in a graphic adaptation, it makes it very accessible for people of a younger generation just to sit down, look at the pictures, oh, I get this, and then sometimes they get interested in other pieces. So in working, Studs Terkel's working, and in the graphic adaptation that Pekar does of working, he actually chooses Roberto Acuna, farm worker, as one of the pieces that he really looks at. And so one of the things that Dylan Miner, who is actually the artist for this piece, one of the things that he does is he actually uses this mixed tech cultural artwork, which is something that if you go into Latin American countries, down into South America, this is that traditional artwork. So he actually gives the history, the culture of Roberto Acuna just simply through this artwork itself. And it's also that interview style of writing from the panels, and you actually get this crossover of the gutter itself, so you've got the connections actually of these different panels. And he talks about in here with this interview style, he actually lets Roberto Acuna do the talking. I walked out of the fields 2 years ago. I saw the need to change the California feudal system. So we actually get that original wording from Roberto himself. The other nice thing that this interview does is it doesn't just provide Roberto's struggle, it also gives his mother's side of things. He offers up that female struggle as well. And so you actually get this female here who is his mother, and she has the bags under her eyes, she's got kind of this messy hair, and she looks like she has been working hard all day and she is miserable. And then, of course, you've got, you know, the well-dressed, almost monster in the booth screaming out, I need my food, I need my food, I want my bill. And so it continues to be that whole idea of the struggle to earn money and the lack of respect that comes with it. Continuing on, we also have the whole idea that these panels focus on the I, but they also describe the we experience. And so one of the things that Roberto Acuna points out in his interview is that he was literally born in the fields. His mom was out working in the fields, she water broke, and bam, here we have a baby all of a sudden. And so he makes that connection here that he was actually born in the fields, he was born of the earth, and he is also part of that working culture. And we've got the couple that are standing here actually still working in the fields, that whole idea that the work doesn't stop even though there's a new birth, which should be celebrated. It is also a voice of culture. All throughout this entire piece, you've got Spanish phrases all the way through. So it's actually that praising of these migrant farm workers, especially the Latino ones, who are using their language out in the fields. They're offering help, which is actually what this means. How are you today? Can I help you? The other idea is that music is a huge part of culture in general, and so one of the panels that they actually include is the strike and them singing De Colores, which is actually a traditional Spanish song. However, we also have the suppression of voice. And Roberto Acuna talks about in his interview that he had memorized the Gettysburg Address. He was so proud of that, and he wanted to be the one that recites it. And this whole idea of assimilation pops up here because actually the fields are almost set up like the background of the flag. He wants to join American society. However, he actually ends up quitting school not long after this because they actually give it to a farmer's daughter who speaks better English than he does, even though she didn't even have it memorized. And then there is this lack of emphasis on education. We've got, of course, this huge sign, Welcome to California, and then we've got here in the center of this panel, focus on child labor up the road, cheap labor. And then even more importantly, we have a piece of his homework, and he calls it Mi Tarea, which is my homework in Spanish, and it's got the gold star on it. Well, what would happen for a lot of these migrant worker children, they would actually get a week off from school so that they could go help in the fields, and they would get a gold star that day for their homework or for that week just for going to work in the fields. Their education wasn't valued. And of course, in the background, we have this crop duster of death. The whole idea of how deadly this work was on so many levels. Then we've got the idea of the voice of work. He describes these harsh working conditions. We've got issues as far as them building or bending over with these very, very short hose trying to work in the fields. Quite a few of the migrant workers, as Roberto points out, would have horrible issues with their backs afterwards because they're doing this for 10, 12 hours a day or more. He also highlights in here how they would actually work in the heat, in the snow. It didn't matter. And one of the things, and I'm not sure if you can exactly see it, but up here where the sun is supposed to be, there's actually the little skull there that's been split, and it shows, or it provides that emphasis on just how deadly this actually could be. Then we've got this description of needs and desires for acceptance. After he dropped out in 8th grade, he, by age 16, became a foreman because they needed more money. That was a good thing to do. And part of the way that he would actually help some of the migrant workers that could not speak decent English or were completely illiterate, he would actually sit down to write letters for them. He would help them with paying bills, trying to get raises and things along those lines. And he actually naively thought that him being that foreman would help the other migrant workers. Unfortunately, it didn't. The other piece of this is within work, there was always that idea that you were in danger of losing your job. And the biggest fear was that you would end up in these projects, according to him, where you didn't have a whole lot of time to work, to provide for your family, things like that. The next piece is this voice of understanding, and we've got the idea of community, and it's almost set up like a game show where the farmers versus the workers are actually competing against each other. And there is a whole idea that you see and understand that the heroes of the community are actually fighting against the actual farmers themselves. Then, of course, we get the whole idea of solidarity. And one of the things that he focuses on is it's not just the Latinos that are actually fighting, it's everybody. It's anybody that's actually a migrant farm worker. And then, and this is probably one of the most disturbing pieces, the idea that you've got the animals that are valued better than the people, and that they are valued for what they can actually bring to the table. And of course, the crop duster of death, he actually tells a story about a young woman, or a young child who accidentally puts her mouth or her tongue to an implement and drops dead immediately from the poisons. And the idea that they're doing this crop dusting over the actual workers, and then they're getting sick and dying as a result. So how does all of this actually create our modern epic? So we have a common story. I'm going to put several little pieces up here. We have a common story. We've got a worker who's trying to improve his or her circumstances, whether it's the mother or the son. We've got a worker who's actually identifying problems in the work system. It's dangerous to be out here. His fingernails are falling off. People have awful back issues and things like that. We've got the idea that these workers are just simply trying to make it and actually survive. And then and part of that survival is knowing what the health risks are and actually trying to address those. And then that dream of what needs to change. He wants to become the foreman. He wants to try to do something to help the people, and the answer becomes joining a union for him. Then we also, in this modern epic, have a common voice. And with this common voice, our speaker actually uses the language of the working class group. So he's using the Spanish. He's talking about the actual farm implements and things like that, what is actually part of his world. Throughout the entire interview, and even with the different panels, they're very simple. They're very easy to understand and comprehend exactly what's going on. And it actually represents the entire struggle and the entire community. And then, of course, this battle. Because, of course, in an epic, we have to have that epic battle that everybody, wants to see who wins, who loses. And for this, there's actually a multifaceted battle. We've got that battle for better wages. We've got that battle for safer working conditions, for quality control, for an education for a child who simply wants to be part of the American system, and who wants to be able to make it. The idea that understanding that these people are valued, and that they're actually human beings, not some expendable farm implement that can be replaced the next day. And even more important, the battle to actually be seen as a valuable contributor of society itself. So, the heroes. They're stressed, they're struggling, they're always in danger. And the only other people that actually care are the other workers. And maybe that union person that comes along that then is gone sometimes just as quickly. So there's this idea of everyone banding together. And of course, then we have the compromisers. And the compromisers typically in that epic, they're using the unions, they're trying to find that common ground, but the other part of compromising is actually trying to enter into those managerial roles. And with the naive belief that you can actually change things. And then of course we have the villains, and this is one of my favorite panels, setting up the farmer as this evil demon. They are basically, these are your managers, these are your foremen, and they are always demanding more work from you. So you've got to work those 17-hour days and still go to school and everything else. And the whole idea that there must be more product. And then I'm going to skip over to the last little piece here. If it'll let me. There we go. So how the actual modern epic gets defined. It actually tells us the story of the oppressed working class. It describes the struggles and the dreams of this same class and how they can contribute to society as a whole. And more importantly, it gives us the potential for creating change. It gives us tools to create change. One of the defining moments of an epic is how it offers up the wisdom of the past so that we can move it into today's time. And that's one of these things that looking at working class literature as a modern epic actually does. And even more importantly, it encourages us as working class generations to keep fighting for what we believe in, to keep fighting for what rights we know that we need to have. And so that's my presentation.
Okay, thank you so much to our panel. We have about 20 minutes left before we need to clear out of the room, which leaves us some wonderful time for discussion. I just want to let you know that we do have the live streaming happening right now, so if anyone at any point in the audience wants that to cease, please just let us know and we can do that. But I will open the floor up to questions, comments, interact with the panel, and I will facilitate as needed. Yes?
I'm interested in the relationship between the comic book and the graphic novel, or the comic book and the graphic history. Because I think the comic came first. Then there was this sort of notion of let's use the form to talk about something that's doesn't exist in the super world. Right? Are there things that, what gets drawn on from the comic book tradition that goes into the graphic novels? And that's for Sara and you. I just think about how do you bring ideas?
I don't really think there's much of a it's the same medium. Like graphic novel, like comics is the medium, is sort of like the container, and graphic novel to me is I guess like it's just a longer form version of the same medium. It's still a comic. I think that's one of the graphic novel is definitely a misnomer. Like it's for instance, like this I would call this a comic memoir. Like I'm not even really sure that like the expression graphic novel it doesn't describe. It tends to be pretty inadequate. Like it's still just a comic, but I feel like we tend to think of comics as in terms of seriality, right? Like I think that's one of those things that maybe causes confusion around what comics are. But yeah, you're right. Like the rise of this kind of like the long form comic, I think is more what I would is more how I would describe a graphic novel or a comic memoir. Things like I think that someone like Harvey Pekar, but even that, like American Splendor, it gets packaged. And I think a lot of it has to do too with like the ways that it has been sort of packaged for consumption, and then it gets called this thing called a graphic novel or a graphic memoir, when actually it was serialized originally, and it was coming out in these other forms. And same with Watchmen is the perfect example. It was also serialized over the course of about, I think, 2 or 3 years, and then in 1986 it was published as a graphic novel. So it's the same thing. I think it's still just all comics, but there was something that legitimated comics as a medium when it became available in this longer form way, where it's like the parts could be put together as sort of like a fuller narrative in these ways.
So, but you don't see that the supernatural part of the comics tradition is central to comics, then?
No.
Mm-mm.
I mean, go ahead.
Well,
say more.
And I think about too, like the Sunday morning comics. I mean, you don't have the superhero aspect of that at all. I mean, a lot of times they're just everyday life. So for me, whenever I look at a comic book, it's more that it's very episodic in nature. Okay, the Avengers or Superman or whoever is going out to battle this particular problem today. And in the next comic, it's either continued or it might be a brand new battle with a same or similar villain. And for me, whenever I look at the graphic adaptations, whenever I look at a graphic novel, it really is, as Sara was saying, kind of bringing it all together so that it tells that one complete story in that one book. Because even within the comic book tradition, there will be a story arc. And it just happens to be in these tiny little books. And it's become a tradition probably the last maybe 20 years or so to kind of bring it all together so that collectors can have it all in one hardbound book.
Yeah, and a lot of it I think also had to do with actually the site at which comics were originally available, like especially like in the more kind of indie and alternative comics scene. Like that's part of what started helping comics become, I think, legitimate, for better or worse, legitimated as literature, was that the head shops, like where Robert Crumb and some of the, the 70s comics used to be sold. I mean, there were all these obscenity statute, laws that were changed, and those shops were shut down. And then it was like, where did those, and then so these alternative comic book shops that sort of started becoming a thing, I think, in the the early 90s. It was just like a different, like the distribution of those comics became that they were packaged differently because those alternative comic book shops, in order to survive and to sell comics, had to package them differently. And so there was also sort of like the intersection with this evolution in sort of like the material availability of these comics that interestingly led them to become more legitimated as literature, because they had to be packaged this way for these smaller comic book shops to continue to survive.
And even in these stores, the shopkeepers didn't know where to put them on the shelves, because they didn't want the parents yelling at the shopkeepers. So on the bottom shelves would be the superhero stuff, and on the top they would sort everything that wasn't superhero, and that meant that like the more pornographic stuff like Cherry Pop Tart and heavy metal would be put next to like Mouse and Love and Rockets. And Love and Rockets has a buxom female character in it. So I thought Love and Rockets was porn. So like I never read it, So it's like a weird setup.
Which is so unfortunate, because it's like one of the most feminist comics out there.
Yeah, it's like it's right next to Cherry Pop Tart. So
I know. That's confusing.
It's really. But I think everything. A lot of stuff was serialized. I didn't realize Mouse was, but actually,
Mouse was too.
I think the first graphic novel was a Jewish Great Depression memoir called A Contract with God by Will Eisner, and that was drawn complete as a book, and he coined the term, but it has been co-opted by, you can get 4 years of Black Panther this big in a graphic novel. Like, stop muddying it. Like it's, so it was cool for a while as a way of saying, no, this is not a collection, but
Well, and I think for a while, graphic novel was really used as a marketing term
Totally.
to make comics respectable.
Yeah.
My first encounter was Watchmen. It was taught in a graduate class that I took when I was in graduate school in about 1990, and it was unheard of and revolutionary to teach a graphic novel in a graduate American literature class at that time. And the only way that it could be represented as an object of study in a graduate literature class was to call it a graphic novel rather than a superhero comic.
And even calling it, I don't know, because so many of sort of the the sort of like long form comics that are taught in literature classes today, because it's much more, it's gone through this process of canonical legitimation.
Right.
But the most common ones that are being taught are actually, for the most part, are memoir, or Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, Mouse, but they get, what is it about this like label of novel? It's still difficult for me, even when I'm talking about these texts with my students, to I don't know, but because even the idea of teaching memoirs in a class, I think it doesn't have the same kind of literary cachet to say you're teaching a comic memoir as it does to say you're teaching a graphic novel.
Right, and it is definitionally
even though
not a novel.
It's not a novel.
Because
It's
novels
not a
are
novel.
fiction.
Yeah.
And so if it's a memoir, it's not a novel. So.
And there are novels. I think it worked for Watchmen, because Watchmen could be, even though it was ultimately it was a serialized sort of, much more in the, much more, I don't know, intellectualized kind of form of superhero. I mean, it was doing this kind of, I don't know, it had this meta commentary on the superhero genre or whatever, as a part of its also presentation of this like realist again, the sci-fi. I mean, it was such a sort of like weave of different genres, and yet it was fiction. It was fictionalized science. Kind of like alternative reality.
Yeah.
And so it made sense for that text, but most of the others, not so much.
Yeah, Persepolis is nonfiction.
No.
Well, I think the most teachable comics most often in English departments do fit in this sort of multi-ethnic American literature or memoir, and it's a way of breaking through a sort of an anticipated, how are we going to get the business major males to empathize with, different communities in America? We'll give them a comic book and hope for the best, and it's sort of,
Seriously though, it can work.
and it does work, but it's like, what's funny is, by and large, though, other than that, like most often taught in composition classes, and I don't have a rhetoric degree, so I'm not, So like, what's kind of funny is, in a way, if I want to do superheroes, like, I have to do it in like a film adaptation course. Like English departments are like, get that shit out of here. And I can kind of understand it because it's very mainstream, it's very masculinist, but there's no easy spot for it in an English department, because if you give people credit for reading Batman, then there's the fear you're going to knock out Shakespeare and Toni Morrison, which I can understand because I'm rather partial to them myself. So.
There's a question with that.
Yeah, the whole notion of the class markers relative to the purchase of comics. I remember as a kid having a wallet and then opened up to be able to change purse. I always had 12 cents in there, That way I was always equipped, I was ready. I could go in that store and get something, But just a basic question. I just have no idea. It's probably really quick and basic, but sometimes you call it the funnies, like the Sunday funnies and all. But what does the word comic mean? It comes from comedy. Is that right? Or what does comic actually mean?
I wouldn't be surprised if it is comedy.
It does,
Well, that was kind of how they started out originally back in the 1800s, were that they would often call political cartoons comics or comedies. And so it kind of just continued there, and as the art form changed in the United States in the early 1900s, they just kept that kind of traditional idea behind her. At least that's what I found throughout my research.
Because I'm just wondering whether there's just something that, that it's funny, but not funny in the sense of, like the word funny means something else than what we usually think about it meaning. other words, there's something like funny, you know, about everything we've talked about today.
Yeah.
But
I
there's
think that what it
something
is,
else in there.
it's that sort of like, again, the like the burden of authenticity and realism, like not taking it so. It's art that isn't serious. You know, there's a lack of seriousness. This assumption that gets glommed onto comics because they're drawn in this medium that I think many of us we first come across them as children, and they're associated. You know, they're kind of associated with this maybe not funny but lack of seriousness, which I guess is sort of the antithesis of fun of serious. Funny is maybe the antithesis of serious.
But everything today is very serious.
I know, and that's why you can have these really sort of intent, like deal with really intense, serious themes, but it makes it I don't know, it makes it kind of like approachable. Like even in Persepolis, I mean, there's some panels of disembodied people, just but it's presented in a way that there is something almost kind of where you can get some distance from the horror. Because it's just in this like simplistic, childlike art style, but it can be there's somebody who's been drawn and quartered, as a form of torture, and you can have that, and you can look at it and you can think about it without turning away in horror. And I think that's one of the things that Maus did very effectively, and why its ability to why it's considered one of the most impactful Holocaust memoirs is because it was able to present. Instead of having like the piles of photorealist, emaciated, dead Holocaust victim bodies, you could have that in the form of drawing. You could represent the same sort of thing, but you're not going to recoil in the same way. You're gonna stick with it. You're gonna get drawn further. You're gonna move further in because of that sort of turning it into like a childlike thing.
I was going to ask about that. Like, don't therapists make kids draw their pain?
Yes.
And Linda Barry talks about, remembering when you were a child and drawing and just not worrying about how good the art is. And she says that gets you to a place of tremendous honesty and authenticity, and you simplify things, but in a weird sort of way it makes it truer and more raw. And so, like, I think a lot of autobiographical stuff feels like very confessional, very raw, very therapeutic, right? Like they're doing it for themselves and we're let in on it with these kid-like drawings of their worst memories.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of comics of guys drawing their first sexual experience and we're like, wow, this is like blankets and like I was not expecting that scene,
Yeah.
So, but it's very powerful stuff.
I mean, it's powerful, and the testament to the power is that it gets banned.
Oh,
Like things like Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, because there's one scene depicting like lesbian sex, or one panel that's very, but then it's drawn, and it's very, but it's very in your face, and I've read a little bit, done a little research on the banning of that particular text, and everyone mentions that, just that very panel in that text as being what has led to this, this is inappropriate, for our high school students to read. And there's something about the power, that the power of having your identity and awareness pulled into the vacuum of that comic, I think, leads them to be banned so often.
And the irony is the most dangerous thing about that comic is the father living his life in the closet, killing himself.
Yeah.
Which is not that drawing, right? I mean, so.
Question over here?
Hi. I'm sort of dipping my toe into this world for the first time, so thank you for sort of explaining it. I'm a sociologist, and in September I'm going to teach on my third year class for the first time. I don't know if it's a graphic novel or the core text I'm going to use is called Portraits of Violence, and it's called an illustrated work. And it's basically it's like a cartoon explaining state violence through Chomsky. So I don't know how it's going to go, because these are sociology students, and sociologists I mean, I think my students, because I work in a university that is a working class student body, so I imagine that they will really get it. But there's 2 other books as well. I don't know if it's the same here, but there seems to be an interesting rise in radical work that is graphic. There's the Emma Goldman, the Rosa Luxemburg one.
Margaret Sanger, there's another one.
And then I don't know if you've seen the Louise Michel one. And now there's this new one that I've just found called Portraits of Violence. And it's literally, it's through comic explaining state violence. So I'm not sure how it will go, but, do you see that this sort of method of teaching can cross over into, that's not, we're not looking at the literature, we're looking at the content. And I want to use it as a tool.
Perfect.
To teach
Yeah.
violence.
I learned how to read because of comic
effective.
books.
Yeah.
I like reading. I don't think of reading as homework because of the joy of comic books.
Well, that's what I'm hoping is going to happen, actually, my students, that they're going to look at this book and really want to get involved with it, rather than the essay, the standard sort of Chomsky essay.
And Gloria Steinem got started reading Wonder Woman comics.
Yeah, she did.
So.
I mean, one of my favorite readings in college was by the political cartoonist in Mexico, El Fiscón, and he wrote How to Succeed at Globalization. And it was sort of a early, late 90s, early 2000s book that was sort of making fun of the U.S.'s sort of impact with the Monroe Doctrine and all of the ways that it had impacted South America. And I think, it's a really digestible way of getting a lot of basic information about the history without it sort of being so overwhelming. And I think for me, it was like just a piece that was thrown in with a bunch of other elements that we were studying, but like that's the thing I still remember, like our learning styles are really different, and so like also engaging students with different learning styles.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to use this.
It's also more memorable.
I'm going to use this
sticks.
as the core text. So this is going to be, and the university is going to buy the book for each student. So,
Could I just jump in there with a potential problem? I was trying to ask about like the politics of teaching. I teach graphic novels awful. When they're really graphic, right? Thinking like Phoebe Glockner's Child's Life, that like risks to represent her sexual assaults. And you don't have time to give students a warning. There's no trigger warning, because the minute you buy it, you open it, you could see that assault. And how do you negotiate and navigate that difficult terrain if you are going to teach difficult, traumatic subjects where there is that visual representation, which could be traumatizing for students to experience.
Do students start reading before?
Well,
the semester starts. Wow, you got great students.
You flip it open and you see it.
Or they even
Is
walk the book
uniquely-
before they come to
Yeah.
class.
I think
Yeah.
it seems to be art
It's looking,
in terms of
you look
her
at it,
artistic
you see
vision.
the
It's like
visual
she doesn't really
representation of
rely so
sexual
much
assault.
on
She doesn't
amplification through simplification in the same way.
No.
It's like hers is more. Phoebe Glockner, I don't know, I'm trying to work that out because I think Phoebe Glockner is like A Child's Life is distinctly like compared like I think that representations of trauma actually you don't need trigger warnings for a lot of graphic novels because of the way that it you're not going to recoil in the same way
Well, it's
from imagery.
cartoony, right? In the cloud becomes
Right.
abstract. Glockner doesn't do that.
Glockner doesn't do that in the same. There's something she I don't know. There is something about her particular
Well, she's a
artistic
medical artist.
style.
She's got more of that realistic
Yeah.
comic art that's becoming more popular,
Right.
actually.
But she draws a
But she
penis,
also-
like that. It's
but she
detailed
also-
with the
she-
veins,
yeah.
and like
Mhm.
it's.
She also adopts certain kinds of abstract, almost cinematic techniques in her presentation of her art, like where, I think like the emotional impact of like of her art is not, like so I can understand like that particular comic is one
I
that
don't think I could do that.
it's.
I like your nerve.
It'd be hard,
It's incredible to teach.
would be
And
hard
you
to
clearly have
approach.
solid institutional support to
Yes.
back up from your,
No, I got in a lot of trouble the first time.
But you're still here telling the tale.
And you're still teaching it.
If you see her point, she designs it as a comic book, so it wants to lure you in. Like it's a promise, like childhood should be safe, but it's like it's
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and the cover's really
She kind of
benign.
hits you with a
and this
sledgehammer.
rape culture, right? That like it's this ideological fiction that childhood is safe, right? And part of that, to me, part of her aesthetic strategy is that, right, part of it that we don't represent sexual violence and don't think seriously about it, or the sort of trauma. And again, that risk of representation is what we shoot says. What they have to do is wrestle with that and not be protected from it. It was, but I did get in a lot of trouble. I had to talk with the dean about it. But to me, I won the battle, I guess.
Yeah, I could have more than a talk with the dean.
But you can lose your job. You can lose your job doing
Yeah,
that, right?
yeah.
But those are kind of those.
The right student who picked that up?
Yeah, right, because I've got in my class, probably a third of them are Muslim girls. I think I get in serious trouble if I show that. And not to say that actually it's not really important, you know, to actually show the violence in sexual violence is actually really important.
There's so many novels I started in the English department, but there's so much sexual assault in American literature. I mean, like, and that's not an issue, but when it becomes a comic or graphic novel, then it's
It isn't an issue.
Oh.
Yeah, I think
Well,
it's still
but
an issue.
Yeah.
to kind of
you
address
could be
that,
Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
A sexual assault in American
Yeah.
well, with like Roberto Acuna's interview, we can sit down with that book and very safely just read the words on the page and distance ourselves from it.
Yeah.
As soon as you see these artistic panels, all of a sudden you're involved.
Yeah.
Because you have to, as my co-panelists have said, you have to get involved. The artist, the writer demand in those gutters that you take action. And so that's one of the things that you really have to think about. It becomes much more personalized.
You know, who's going to lose their job teaching to love, I don't think, right?
You know, whether we should, you know, because violence in sexual violence is violent.
Yeah.
So there is, I don't know.
Well, it's about imagery and sort of like what you're saying, even about like pornography. You know, like imagery has the potential to code as pornography in ways, and I think that also makes it a more difficult question to approach. Like, I mean, there's certain another Melinda Gebbie and Alan Moore's. Oh God, sorry, I'm forgetting. I just blanked on the name of it, but it's like.
Is it the Four Girls?
Yeah, it's like this volume of, I mean, it's straight up pornography, but it's also written by Alan Moore, who's one of the, you know, like he wrote Watchmen, and Melinda Gebbie is just this, you know, she uses all this kind of phantasmagoric art style, but I would never teach that, you know, because I mean, it's just nothing but like, you know, all kinds of incredibly graphic, you know, pansexual experiences on every page, basically, and yet it's beautiful and it's mesmerizing, but it's not. Yeah, I mean, so there's always, I think, and maybe that's sort of one of the objections to, you know, to fun home, to, you know, this idea that like depicting sexuality in a visual form always has the potential to code as pornography. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for being here.